By the time officials returned to the site in the birdie-protected landscape area, the water was already backing up. A wetland had begun to form, and a project trapped in paperwork for 7 years had been completed in 2 days by 8 Eurasian beavers. No contractors, no concrete, no machinery, just mud, branches, stones, and instinct in exactly the right place. The Czech authorities had spent years trying to restore this drained patch of land with a projected cost of 30 million Czech korunas. Then, almost overnight, the animals built several dams on an old military drainage gully and did what the state had not yet managed to do. So the question is not whether the beavers were faster, it is how they knew where to build. They knew because the land had been telling the same story for 100 years. In 1925, the Czech military took control of this part of the Brdy region about 64 kilometers southwest of Prague. What had once been wet ground was treated like a problem, so soldiers cut a drainage channel through it, a bypass gully. Straight, functional, cold. Its job was simple: move water out fast. And for decades, it did. The ground dried, the shallow pools vanished. Soft marsh plants gave way to harder, poorer cover. What should have held life began to repel it. By the 2010s, conservation officials were looking at a damaged system inside the birdie-protected landscape area. Not a dramatic disaster, something quieter, a landscape that had been taught to stay empty. That was the unsettling part. Nothing looked broken enough to alarm you at first. No smoking crater, no poisoned river, just a place that no longer behaved like itself. Environmental planners drafted a restoration project in 2018. The fix sounded modest: slow the drainage, raise the water, let the wetland return. The estimated cost was 30 million Czech korunas. And then the project stalled. Land ownership questions. Negotiations between the Military Forest Administration and the Vltava River Basin Authority. Permits, reviews, more waiting. Year 1 passed. Then year 3. Then year 5. On paper, the dam still existed. On the ground, nothing changed. Until small signs began appearing where nobody had approved anything. Freshly cut branches, gnawed trunks, mud pushed into the flow. Not random damage, not feeding marks alone. A ranger in Brdy noticed the pattern almost immediately. Something was building inside the abandoned logic of that military channel. And once the first barrier held, the water did something it had not done there in decades. It slowed, only slightly at first. A thin hesitation in the current. Then another. Then a second obstruction appeared upstream. That changed the mood immediately. One dam could be dismissed as animal activity. 2 started to look like intent. Officials already had a human plan for this exact area. That was the awkward detail. The beavers were not improvising in the wrong place. They were building in the place engineers had identified on paper years earlier. Bohumil Fier, head of the Brdy Protected Landscape Area, later described it with a kind of stunned respect. Nature had created the biotope conditions practically overnight, but in the moment, nobody knew how far it would go. And not everyone saw a success story. A blocked channel can flood paths, it can drown young trees, it can force water into places that had stayed dry for decades. In a protected landscape shaped by military history, that is not a small concern. So while one timeline was still moving through land negotiations and documentation, the other had already begun with teeth and instinct. No tender, no contractor, no waiting for signatures. Just 8 Eurasian beavers reading the land faster than the people managing it. The mini twist was this: the old drainage gully that humans had cut to empty the site had become the perfect structure for animals trying to fill it again. The damage itself had become the blueprint. By early 2025, several dams were taking shape inside that narrow artificial channel. Branches locked into mud, stones pressed low into the base, water starting to pool where it was never meant to linger. And the more it lingered, the harder it became to pretend this was temporary. Because once a beaver dam begins to hold, the landscape starts making decisions of its own. And at Brdy, the first real decision was only 48 hours away. 48 hours later, the channel no longer looked like a channel. It looked interrupted. The first dam had thickened, the second had widened, and a third barrier was beginning to catch the slower water slipping around the edges. That was the first unsettling detail. The beavers were not building one obstacle, they were building a sequence, a system. At the same time, the human timeline was still frozen in its familiar posture. Ownership issues, agency coordination, documents moving between the Military Forest Administration and the Vltava River Basin Authority. The contrast was becoming hard to ignore. One side was still discussing how to hold water here, the other had already started doing it. Men on site saw the difference almost immediately. Not in theory, in sound. The runoff had changed pitch. Fast water makes one kind of noise. Held water makes another. What had been a narrow, draining rush now broke into pauses, eddies, and quiet backed-up pressure against mud and sticks. That kind of silence can be unnerving, because it means the land is no longer obeying the design imposed on it. Then came the mini twist. The old military gully was helping the beavers more than anyone expected. Its cutbanks narrowed the flow. Its shape forced water into exactly the kind of bottleneck beavers exploit best. The man-made scar was accelerating the animal repair. And once the base held, the rest became easier. Branches locked together, mud sealed the gaps, stones weighed the structure down. Nothing about it looked elegant. That was what made it persuasive. It looked rough, temporary, almost careless, but the water level kept rising anyway. And with rising water came a new problem. The ground around the channel started softening faster than some officials were comfortable with. Dark, wet patches spread into places that had stayed firm for years. Boots sank deeper. The edge stopped feeling stable. For a moment, that raised a real fear. What if the beavers had chosen too well? What if they flooded more than the restoration plan intended? That tension changed the reaction on site. There was admiration now, but also caution, because everyone could see that once water returns, it does not ask permission before redrawing a place. Then the second surprise arrived. The dams were not sitting in the wrong location by coincidence. They were sitting almost exactly where conservation planners had wanted the landscape to start holding water again. Not nearby, not approximately, on the bypass gully itself. The animals had found the weak point in the drainage system that experts had identified on paper years before. That is when this stopped feeling like a curious wildlife story. Now, it felt like a direct challenge. To planning, to delay, to the assumption that restoration only begins when a file is approved. By the end of those first days in early 2025, one thing was no longer debatable. A small pond had appeared, and around it, the first edge of wetland was starting to form. By March 2025, the pond was no longer a pond. It was a system. Aerial photographs taken by the Birdie Protected Landscape Administration showed 7 distinct water bodies strung along the old gully, each one held behind its own dam, each one feeding the next. The wetland the 2018 plan had described on paper now existed on the ground, without a single approved tender. Hydrologists returned to take measurements in April. The numbers did something nobody on the original planning committee had managed in 7 years. They closed the file. Water table readings across the restored section showed a rise of 38 centimeters compared to the 2017 baseline survey. The surface area of standing water measured just under 2 hectares. Officials cross-checked that figure against the original 2018 restoration proposal. The target stated in that document was 2.1 hectares of restored wetland. The beavers had missed the human target by less than 10%. Without a survey, without an engineer, without a single meeting. Then came the species data. Amphibian surveys conducted in May 2025 recorded breeding more frogs at the site for the first time since record keeping began in the 1990s. Dragonfly species count rose from 4 to 11 within a single season. A pair of black storks was photographed foraging at the edge of the largest pool in June, a species the Regional Ornithological Society had not recorded breeding in this exact section of Birdie in over 2 decades. None of it had been planned. None of it had been funded. Then, the cost report landed on someone's desk. The Birdie Protected Landscape Administration had spent, across 7 years of consultancy fees, hydrological modeling, legal review, and administrative coordination, approximately 30 million Czech korunas pursuing a wetland that did not yet exist. The beavers had no budget line, no invoice, no contractor's fee. Bohumil Fear, asked directly by a regional journalist what the animals had cost the state, gave an answer that made it into print without elaboration. Nothing. The number sat there, stripped of context, doing more work than any spreadsheet the committee had produced in 7 years. A government department spends 30 million korunas trying to approve a wetland. 8 beavers build one for free in 2 days, accurate to within 0.2 of a hectare. That comparison did not stay contained to one regional newspaper. It was about to travel a great deal further than anyone in Birdie expected. The story reached Reuters by July 2025. From there, it moved through European wire services, then into wildlife and environmental press across Germany, the UK, and the United States. The detail that traveled fastest was the simplest one. 30 million karunas, 7 years, 0 results. 8 beavers, 2 days, a functioning wetland. Czech environmental officials found themselves fielding a question they had not anticipated needing to answer, not whether beaver reintroduction worked. The birdie population, descended from earlier conservation releases along the Letavka River system, had already proven that. The real question was procedural. If a protected landscape administration had quietly permitted natural processes to run unmanaged in this exact corridor years earlier, would the wetland have existed already without the consultancy fees, without the 7 years, without the 11 hectares of paperwork generated to approve 2.1 hectares of water? Nobody at the Ministry of the Environment had a comfortable answer. The Birdie case has since been cited in at least 3 policy reviews examining Czech wetland restoration procedure, including a 2025 internal report from the Vltava River Basin Authority recommending expanded passive restoration zones areas where beaver activity would be monitored rather than pre-engineered. It is a quiet bureaucratic phrase for something larger, an admission that the system built to protect nature had, in this instance, been outpaced by nature acting without it. The pond at Birdie is still there. More frogs still breed along its margins each spring. The black storks returned again in 2026, this time with confirmed nesting activity nearby, the first in that section of the reserve since regional records began. Bohumil Fear still manages the site. He has said, in more than one interview since, that he no longer drafts restoration budgets the way he used to. He checks for beaver activity first. 8 animals did not outsmart an entire government. They simply moved before the paperwork caught up and left behind a number that nobody in that 7-year process has been able to explain away. 0 karunas, 2 days, 1 functioning wetland that the state had spent 30 million trying and failing to build. If stories like this one are the kind that stay with you, there's a quiet channel here still finding them.